Is having too many kids a bad thing? Is Trump the first authoritarian U.S. president? And is an embryo different than a baby because of freezers? Britt and I tackle these questions and more on this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hello, friends. Welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the show where we go through the internet to find the most interesting takes, and we talk about what they get right and what they get wrong. My name is Donald. I'm here with my co-host, Britt. Before we get started, just a reminder to follow us on socials. Good Take, Bad Take Pod on Instagram and Good Bad Take Pod on Twitter and YouTube. And leave a comment and give us a like, all that stuff. Helps us out a ton. Let us know what kind of likes do you love to hear? Which ones are you not so keen on? Do you have a take for us? We love it all. Send it our way. All right, without further adu, we're going to get into our first take here. This is a meme showing the sort of angry soy jack talking to a family with a kid, and the soy jack is saying, having kids is super expensive and you'll barely have any time for yourselves. And then it shows the next panel where the family has grown to 2 kids, and the soy jack is angrier, saying, overpopulation is a serious issue. You're wasting resources to satisfy primitive urges. And then in the final panel, there is a larger family still, and the soy jack is practically melting, saying, stop being happy. And what do you make of this meme here?
Well, I guess it's like, are we critiquing the sarcastic point it's trying to make, or are we critiquing
just the overall message of the meme?
Overall,
like
okay, all right.
Yeah.
All right, yeah, I think that this meme is good because it's making fun of this worldview and it's pointing something out about this worldview that's true. A lot of people will, I think we've done some takes from people that are like child-free advocates, and one of the types of ways they justify that type of worldview is they have a broader philosophical, more altruistic perspective that it's actually good to not have children because you're destroying the world and you're bringing people into suffering and all this different types of things. And it's delusional. Like it's really just a cover for their own selfishness, for their own justification for what the ideal is that they are not living up to. It's very much like when people criticize, like, oh, well, that's just such a Western mindset, or that's just so Western or whatever. It's like, actually, the West is like insanely impressive. And I think that the reason you're criticizing the West, and of course, everything has reasons to be criticized, but what they're criticizing the West about is because they have not lived up to the ideals that, started the West and that made the West what it was. And that's kind of like humans' condition, is to criticize ideals that we don't live up to, and having children and having a family and rise into that challenge, because it is true. It's really expensive. You will not have any more time for yourselves. Like, I'm speaking as a dad of just one child who can't even crawl yet. So they're basically like a nice, loving little potato that you carry around, and they make cute noises. Even when they're in that form, they take up all of your time and you have no time for yourselves. All of that is completely true, but it's like the most rewarding and best thing that I've ever done. And I think that everyone who has ever had kids will also tell you that for the most part. And so these people, when they're saying these sorts of things, it's because they see an ideal, they see what they should be doing, but they know they're not going to live up to it. And rather than trying to, get themselves into a place where they will live up to it, they justify it by trying to claim some other type of higher ground of virtue. And obviously that's not true. Happiness is true. Happiness or true joy results from doing things that are meaningful, not from doing things that just satisfy your actual primitive urges. Like, as this person, or like the people that would say these things, they really are just selfish, and they only want to satisfy lower level urges of like, oh, I just want to be free and go do what I want and eat what I want and go sleep with who I want without any of the commitment or responsibility. That's an actual primitive urge. An urge that is long lasting and looks towards the future is one that says, hey, I'm going to bring kids into the world, make the sacrifice necessary for them to have a better life and for my grandchildren to have a better life.
Yeah, the other position of the people who this meme is critiquing, the take, in the middle line here is talking about overpopulation, and so if we sort of assume the best, right? I think that you're right in that most people are just trying to justify their own selfish impulses. I mean, like, that's kind of the like you mentioned, we've gone over the dink memes and stuff like that, and that's again what the first line sort of refers to, that says, oh, it's super expensive, you'll barely have time. And then the second line, let's assume that you have someone who genuinely is concerned about the overpopulation issue. The interesting thing about that is there's a whole host of ways you can kind of tackle the specifics if you look at studies and you look at data. And a lot of those studies that will talk about overpopulation will do so with an agenda in mind. It's very hard to find unbiased studies in many ways. Oftentimes they will be writing in order to get some kind of a grant for a green project or something like that. So that's one thing you have to be careful about. I remember, in fact, one study that was used to justify all kinds of climate related reasons why overpopulation would be bad in climate measures. And if you had applied the model sort of retroactively, accounting for everything, you would have had Alexander the Great's army, his entire army, be like 5 people, and that would have been the population of the earth. So it sometimes the way that history arcs and the trajectories aren't always particularly accurate. But moreover, the bigger issue is the perspective of these people is one of, when another person exists, they take up resources, they take up this pie of material and values. And it is true that children are economic parasites. That is true. You're pretty much, until you start earning a living on your own and are independent, you are an economic parasite. But the beautiful thing about humanity's productivity curve is that you grow out of that and you actually generate more than you take up in the vast majority of cases. And so one of the best, most sustainable resources that humanity has for things like overpopulation and climate controls is humanity itself. The more people you have, the more ingenuity, the more innovation, the more people who are able to take sort of the natural chaos of the world and the natural state of poverty and turn it into ordered productivity. And so that's one of the biggest paradigm shifts that you have to start thinking about. And you can't just, when people come in with like, oh, overpopulation is a scary problem, they are implicitly putting their worldview on you. And it's very easy to be like, oh, wow, that's scary. And I'm going to buy into it because of the way they present the facts. But you have to take a step back and realize they're selling you on a lot of other assumptions that are, they may not even realize they're assuming by selling you their overall narrative of overpopulation. You have to take a step back and realize maybe their worldview is actually fundamentally wrong on a bigger level than even, all the numbers that they're going to kind of throw at you.
That's a really good point. And it's like you're talking about the underlying assumptions that are part of this worldview that aren't, they might not even realize they have them. And it's almost like a sort of projection, right? Because there's a certain type of person that generally makes this argument. I've known very productive people that have made this argument. But majority of the time, like, they're not super productive, and maybe they aren't looking to increasingly add value at wherever they work, or be a multiplier of value, in their lives and what they provide to society and how they contribute. And by contribute, I don't mean in a socialist way. I mean just by like doing things that are awesome and producing things that are awesome. And so it's like, it would make sense if you have that worldview that like, oh, I just, I go and I do my job and I what is the term? They quiet quit or whatever, where it's like, I just kind of basically do the bare minimum. It's like, yeah, of course, if everyone did that and every new person that was born did that, then yeah, overpopulation would be somewhat of a serious issue, because, and I wouldn't even be overpopulation. It's just, it's lack of production is the actual issue that occurs for that. And so a lot of the problems that these people assign to like, or think that is caused by overpopulation or people existing, it's actually just the problem of not productive people existing, or people that are, exist under some form of, rule or government or system that makes it very hard to be productive. And they confiscate the resources from the people that are productive and give them to people who are not productive. Most of our issues surrounding, any of these things that they would assign to overpopulation are occurring because of a misallocation of resources that comes from the top, not because there's too many people that want to be productive.
That's a great point. So, I don't think I have too much more to say on this particular meme, but just the idea of children really needs to be a cultural benefit, and I think that we need to once again raise up the family. And as one of the points I think Michael Malice makes a lot is not necessarily only the nuclear family, as a lot of the political conservative movement will say, but also extended family. And this can take different forms depending on your upbringing, but just relying on family as a construct is a much better safety net. It's a much better support system. And again, when you are sort of thinking in a selfish way, you might be saying, oh, it's going to cost so much, I'm going to lose out on all these, monetary benefits or free time or whatever. But what you don't see is what you gain in not only the immeasurable joy of a family, of human relationships and stuff. It's work, but that is a unique value that no money will ever buy, no leisure time will ever buy. But you also are creating a good support system, and I think that that's really important because, frankly, we move also into the realm of government reliance for support systems, and the reason why sometimes people feel the need to have those is because they don't have natural built-in ones through families, which I think are a much better alternative for the most part. Okay, we'll move on to our next take here. This one is posted by the Libertarian Party, but it is a quote. But he had his trial somewhat recently. But his quote is, "You have to start with the truth. The truth is the only way that we can get anywhere, because any decision making that is based upon lies or ignorance can't lead to a good conclusion." And of course, Julian Assange is the founder of WikiLeaks, for anyone not familiar, which was the publishing platform for a lot of confidential files that were given to him. He essentially is a journalist that was relaying the information. He didn't even necessarily break any laws to get the information, but has been horrendously persecuted for that. So, what do you make of his take on the truth?
Yeah, it's this is a good take from Julian Assange. Like, how can we ever get anywhere if you have things built on faulty assumptions? I work in an industry, and I had a startup that like worked with data to try and make predictive maintenance calls on equipment. And like one of the biggest issues with that entire idea of like, hey, if we can monitor this data, have the equivalent of a human looking at all these different various points on a piece of equipment, we should be able to make conclusions off of that and kind of forecast the future based on trend lines and stuff like that. One of the biggest challenges about that is making sure that the sensor data that you get is actually accurate, because if it's not accurate, if it's not true, if it's not representative of reality, then all of your assumptions and all of your forecasts that come about from it are going to be off by magnitudes more than what you're off at the source. And so, you do have to start with the truth. Or if you don't know the truth right at the beginning, you need to at least start from a desire to just know the truth, whether it is good for your position or bad for your position, or good or bad for whatever type of agenda you might have, right? Your only agenda as a journalist, or I guess in general, should be what the truth is. Where it gets really, really bad is like, people have different types of agendas, and so they bend the truth, or they ignore the truth, or they come up with little white lies or things like that. And maybe they lie in just one little bit of information, and that causes tons of different types of chaos. It makes people make decisions that they wouldn't otherwise make. And so, like these, and because Julian Assange mainly reported on like our wars and stuff in the Middle East, I think that like you can definitely see the cascade of assumptions, whether they were white lies, actual lies, or just people trying to kind of make information fit an agenda that they had. It's like, it resulted in millions of people dying, right? And trillions of dollars being spent. And so if you want just a small or large example of what not starting with the truth can cause, the type of damage it can cause, just look at that scenario that we've been in the Middle East for the past 3 decades.
Yeah, and frankly, it's one of the things that should stir your thinking as to why he's being so heavily persecuted, because really I feel like this is a good quote just in regards to his stands and what he's been doing, because he of course didn't, acquire the information other than being fed it, but he was in charge of making sure that people heard and saw the information, right? Like that was his entire thing, is that, we need to have the basis of truth available to the public and out so that we know what we're doing. And now you have to think about why in particular, U.S. government is trying to, persecute him so heavily. And then once you realize that relation, that, the government is not an institution that operates on the truth. The government is not an institution that is seeking to maximize the benefit for its constituency, right? It is purely self-interested. And when you have transparency about what things are being done, you will quickly see that they are not operating on the truth, and what they are telling you is not based in that truth. And so Julian Assange is sort of the the platonic ideal, if you will, of what journalism and what the free press is supposed to be to the government, which is why they hate him so much, and also why they hate other sort of independent media, and why they will go so far out of their way to demonize, criminalize, turn the entire narrative against independent journalists or independent people who wouldn't even consider themselves journalists, but are just talking about things like Joe Rogan and I mean, you'd have to show me a lot of evidence that the government didn't at least have some form of encouraging, on his behalf of when they tried to, take him down as a racist. I'm not saying the government did that, but I would not be surprised if there were internal memos of like, let's help promote this, or like, again, I'm not saying it happened, but that's just kind of my assumption these days, based on the way that the government actively pursues people who question the narrative, and who, again, you start with truth. And I will say that is probably one of the more alarming changes, maybe in the cultural sphere as well, in particular with people on the left. Although I would also argue that there is a strain of it on the right as well, which is to say that people are less concerned about the truth. And on the left, I think it's exemplified in sort of a postmodern world that we live in, where they can't even define what a woman is. They don't want to engage with the truth, and when you press them on it, they say, well, why does it really matter? We don't really care. There's just a complete sort of outward rejection of the truth. Whereas on the right, I think it's a lot of the times with Donald Trump, it's like they would say, oh, well, I don't really care if he lies or tells the truth, because he's just, we need to win. It's just so important that the left doesn't win, because they are doing X, Y, or Z. And so it's really important. And so, yeah, Donald Trump may not tell the truth here, but that's okay. And I'm not saying they're equal here, but there is a pardoning of, running from the truth, which I think is really dangerous for the whole culture and for the society as a whole. If it leads to a national divorce, then great. But even if you do that, it's not like these preconceptions go away in the cultures. And so that's one of the biggest problems. I would like a national divorce, but I don't think that fixes all the problems with the culture by any stretch of the mark.
Yeah. It made me think about how, I can't remember where some of this was coming out or which journalists came out about it, but I mean, they openly bragged about the various military advisors to Trump, bragged about like, oh yeah, we belayed his order and did something different, or we told him something different so that we wouldn't do this or do that. And they gave him bad intel and on different types of things that he was going to do in the Middle East. And it's like, okay, yeah, like a lot of like we right now with Israel and Gaza and, the Iranian drone strike that happened. Well, I guess it wasn't Iran that did it, but the Iranian funded drone strike that happened in Syria, like all of these different decisions, like were rooted in decisions that were, all of these different bad outcomes that we're seeing today were rooted in decisions that were made on bad information years ago. They inevitably led to this. And so I think Julian Assange and people like Ron Paul and other folks that said, hey, like, if we're doing these things today, we're trying to get the truth out about what's going on. And then people, because they had some sort of time-sensitive agenda, whether it was to get reelected, or maybe they had some sort of deal with a weapons company that they needed to make some money off of, or something else, fit the truth or fit some version of the truth that was actually a lie into the decision-making, and then it cascaded and spiraled into the mess that we have today. And you can basically assign any policy disaster that has occurred overseas to some bad information, and most of the time it's not it's an unforced error. It was an error made not because like, oh, we're doing the best with what we knew. It's we knew and we still did the worst, which is really unfortunate.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. All right, we'll move on to our next take here, and this one comes from a Twitter user who says, putting a baby in a freezer would kill it, but freezing embryos keeps them alive. That's why an embryo isn't a baby. Hope that helps if you're very stupid, heart. So first of all, I have to say, very convincing tactic. But what do you make of this take?
So we had, you and I both knew this professor back at NU, and he would do, in a communications class in my freshman year, we did like a debate, a British parliamentary debate, mock debate. And one of the ones that I had was on abortion, and I was on the the pro-life side, and we were arguing against a group of. We were at a Christian university, so it was really interesting to see how fired up some of these folks on the pro-choice side got, because hypothetically, like, everyone should have been somewhat pro-life at that point. But someone made a very similar argument to this, and this wasn't the best tactic that I had, but I said, look, lady, like, if I put you in a jungle, like, you'd be helpless too, right? So different states, just because different things are required for you to live at different stages of your development doesn't make you any less human, right? Like, if let's just say a baby like I'm saying, I've got a 5-month-old daughter right now. 2 months ago, like today, she could probably eat a little bit of like mushed up banana or something like that. We haven't done that because it's generally not good for her, but she could eat that. But 2 or 3 months ago, like, her body would not be able to process that. And if we continue to feed her mushed up banana and like oat milk or something like that instead of breast milk or formula, like, she would pass away. She'd be malnourished. Her body would not survive. Is my daughter more like an actual human today because she can eat more human food than, I guess you could argue about breast milk being human food, but whatever. Like, she can eat different types of food today than she could like a few months ago. It's like, no, of course not. We'd all recognize her as a baby both 2 months ago and today. And in the same way that, like, someone with a peanut allergy can't exist in a vat of peanut butter versus someone who is at maybe the same age and for all intents and purposes the same, that doesn't have an allergy, can exist in that vat of peanut butter. Like, just because you're in different stages and different requirements for your existence are different at different stages doesn't make you any less human. So this is just a really silly argument, because I can think of many scenarios where this Twitter user and I could be in the same scenario, but there could be something that's different about her versus me that makes it so that one of us is not going to survive. We're still humans. It's just a different type of survival. It's a different type of requirement. It doesn't change the humanity of us.
Yeah, well, and I mean, your example is great, and you could even be more extreme, and you could be even more, dire with it. Really, like take the same example to say, okay, put a quadriplegic individual in a kitchen, and then tell them to feed themselves. Like, that is the same level where it's like, oh, there's food all around them. They should be able to. It's not even a hostile environment, and so this is a completely artificial, arbitrary line to draw, to say, if you do one thing to a person that kills it, and that same thing does not kill another person, that's just a completely arbitrary line. And it's funny because people on this side will say, oh, we're the scientific ones, we believe in science, and yet they come up with the most creative, uninspired, non-scientific reasons to justify their want of what is ultimately a selfish desire to be able to kill another life without having to live with that guilt because they want to be free of it. Did you have something to chime in here? Or?
Oh, yeah. So what's interesting, like, this lady admits that the embryo is alive, right? Yeah. Like, putting a freezer would kill it, but freezing embryos keeps them alive. It's like, yeah, you've kept them. It's alive, and if it's alive, what is it? Yeah. It's like, well, it's an embryo. Well, what kind of embryo is it? Oh, it's a human embryo. Oh, so right. It's a live human embryo. So it's like, I don't know. It's almost like she defeats her whole the point she's trying to defend here, just within her own take.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. Of course. And yeah. So I'm just I think that the lack of soundness in this tweet really just needs to be exposed, because anyone who sits down and thinks about it for more than 2 seconds will probably recognize this is ridiculous. But if you're just scrolling and you don't think about it, and it reconfirms your own bias, like, yep, that's what bumper sticker takes are designed to do. So you need to be extremely careful about that. And so, if you see something, even if it reconfirms your own viewpoint, at least try to break it down into further detail than the bumper sticker. Like, anything you read on Twitter, assuming they're not like a Twitter Blue user with a much longer post, anything within the, 240 characters now? I don't remember exactly, but anything within that character limit should not be an entirely convincing case for most points, in particular when it's something so nuanced and interesting, like the when does life begin? That's a huge question with so much depth. And if your entire worldview on that is going to be convinced by a line like this, even if you agreed with this, think about it and come up with a little bit more reason why there's a fundamental difference between this kind of state of care versus another kind of state of care. For instance, I mean, even ironically enough, even the idea of vaccinations works in our favor here. Someone who's immunocompromised getting a vaccine would kill them, and someone who's not immunocompromised, a vaccine would not kill them. Does that make the difference between which one's human and which one's not? Of course not. So just like put anything that you hear in these small takes, again, even if you believe it, through as much thought process as you can, or at least sort of divide down. Make sure you're not just agreeing with something and reconfirming your own biases without at least having a more substantiated claim than just that, because this kind of bumper sticker ideology is really stupid when it comes down to it, and very allergic to the truth, I would say. Okay, our next take here comes from Seth Dillon of the Babylon Bee. He tweets, "Why would a man burning himself alive make us want to side with terrorists who still haven't surrendered or released all of their hostages? Someone explained it to me like I'm Kamala Harris."
The last little bit's pretty funny. I'm not gonna lie.
Oh, that's hilarious.
That's pretty good.
Yeah,
but I don't like this take in general, because it's like, so for those of you who don't know or not aware, there was a guy named Aaron Bushnell who went in front of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C., and lit himself on fire to protest the war in Israel and Gaza, particularly trying to advocate for freeing Palestine and an end to the hostilities that are occurring. And he was trying to draw attention to not like, oh, we need to side with the terrorists. I have not really met a lot of people that are that committed to defending Hamas necessarily as they are to saying like, hey, like there's some actual humanitarian grievances being perpetrated on Palestinians. And I think that's a really key thing to kind of undergird, is that it's like, yeah, Hamas is bad. No one in their right mind likes Hamas. Also, if anyone in their right mind saw what was occurring to the Palestinians and knows about the history of what occurred to the Palestinians and how the formation of Israel and Gaza occurred, like if you honestly take a look at it, it's very hard for you to not recognize that an injustice occurred. And that is what Aaron Bushnell, more or less, and I'm not necessarily in favor of setting yourself on fire to make a point, but that was the point he was trying to bring attention to, not that we should go side with Hamas. And so Seth Dillon, whether purposefully or not purposefully, is missing the point, right? It's like your question, he kind of tries to answer his own question, but he answers it in the wrong way. It's like he's not trying to get you to side with the terrorists. He's trying to draw attention to what the problem is in Palestine and the fact that these people have been oppressed and been stomped on and had their land taken from them unjustly. And the longer people don't recognize that, like the more we're going to have things like this happen, because it really is compelling. I don't think that it's a good thing to commit suicide to draw point to something. I think that your life is better spent actually making arguments and advocating for it in a different way. But Aaron Bushnell felt it was that was what he wanted to do, and he was driven to that, whether it was mental health or whatever. The point that he self-statedly wanted to get across is not the one that Seth Dillon is trying to assign to it. Yeah,
and I think so. It's funny because I agree with you in that his perspective and his shift there is completely wrong. What I will say is that I'm sympathetic with his questioning of the idea of like, why would burning yourself alive make us want to change your mind? So I think this is a good and a bad take. I think it's a bad take in that, he's asking the question from a point of view. And I don't think he's doing this to be snarky or tricky. I think it's more just sort of a rhetorical question with a punchline,
Yeah.
And it's a great punchline, and frankly, that's probably why he phrased it that way, right?
Yes.
As a rhetorical question, because I don't think his point is to say I genuinely don't understand why this is trying to make. Sorry, I think his point is to say like this is not convincing for us to take your viewpoint, but you're correct in critiquing it in that he's completely ignoring the actual viewpoint and the wrong
which
view.
Furthers his point, right? That's like burning yourself alive actually it made at least Seth Dillon miss the point of what was going on,
right? And I think that's fair, because it's one of those things where technically or not technically, I mean I've continually said I'm sort of ecumenical or a yes and in terms of promoting liberty and the ways that you do that, whether radically or or incrementally. But of course, there is a line to that, and I think that this is one of those lines where this is actually actively harmful to the message you're trying to spread, and you do need to think about doing it in a way that is, if you're going to get that kind of attention, that's not going to be so, I don't know, self-destructive. And I mean that not in a tongue-in-cheek like joke way. I mean in to the point you're trying to make. And so yeah, so I don't like that he's missing the point here. I think he's probably, you know, I think one of the things that I sort of have to remember when I'm talking to conservatives on this particular issue, and you know, this includes people who I respect and love greatly, you know, is that they oftentimes are presented with the dumbest, worst arguments for the viewpoint here that, for instance, Israel is doing something wrong. And because you have people who are literally burning themselves alive like this to make a point, that's maybe the dumbest way to make the point.
Yes.
But a lot of people make the dumbest points instead of the real points, right? And it, you know, it's the whole experience. I'm sure we've all had it where you're arguing or you're debating with someone on a particular issue, and then someone else comes alongside you and starts agreeing with you, but doing so in the most annoying way or making the wrong points, and you just want them to shut up. And that's those kinds of people are a lot of the people that are being exposed to people who are generally conservative on this issue, because, you know, if you're a Fox News watcher or even just a viral online media person, it's a lot more interesting to highlight the very dumb arguments because they're funny or because you can own them. You know, you can do a Ben Shapiro college style type thing instead of actually looking at the history, instead of actually engaging with the thought. Like I'm happy when, even if a conservative takes the opposite view with me on this, I'm happy to put the stone in their shoe to recognize that Israel's government is actually not a great actor in this. So you might think they're justified in certain things, in particular when you contrast it with things like October 7th recently, and like, well, they need to go in and take out the leadership. You know, even if you and I disagree on the specifics of the action that should be taken now after this obviously wrong attack from Hamas, if I can get the stone in the shoe that it says, hey, Israeli's government is also a government. And you know how, like, you like the US, but you don't like the US government? Maybe the same thing should be considered with Israel and Israeli's government, and the Israeli government, because Benjamin Netanyahu not only created Hamas, but has been double talking on what he wants for the policy. There's a lot of reasons to mistrust the Israeli government and the way that they're handling the situation. It probably isn't perfect. Even if you agree with the overall policy, maybe consider that it's not perfect. And then once you plant that seed, I think there's a lot more openness to nuance on the issue. But again, I have to remember the grace, because I think genuinely the perspective Seth Dillon takes here, where it's, you know, why would we want to side with terrorists who haven't surrendered or released all hostage? That is what some of the really, really dumb people are saying when it comes to this issue. Like the people chanting from the river to the sea or whatever, you know, it's like, you guys are not helping. You're dumb. You're making the dumbest arguments for this. And you really should stop, because you're making it harder for the rest of us.
It's like, like when I see on my feed, a lot of folks like agree with me on, like, we share the same viewpoints about the entire Israeli-Gaza conflict that's occurring, and we share the same viewpoint, but we don't share it for the same reasons. And like that's one of the really difficult things kind of about this whole thing, is like, a lot of people hold positions on this conflict from an ideological standpoint, not because they have some sort of principle that makes them able to see clearly through the fog of all the war and all of the death and all of the history from it. It's just like, oh, well, like Israel's a colonial power, you know, colonizing Gaza, so therefore I'm not going to like them. And like, oh, and also I view the United States and other types of Western powers that way. And it's like, yeah, like some of that's true or whatever, but like the way you got to your conclusion, you know, you did the math problem, you got the right answer, and then I asked you to show your work and you wrote down, you know, A, B, C, D, you know, your alphabet instead of numbers. And you're like, I don't know how you got to this answer, even though it's right, but it's like, it's still indicative of the way you thought about it. And like applying that to this, it's like, you know, this Aaron Bushnell guy, like, if you need case in point evidence of why it's not effective to do something extreme like that, like, yes, you've got the right point that you need to get across, that like, hey, there's issues over there. There's a grave injustice being perpetrated, and we should be paying attention to it from both sides, not just from one angle that certain types of political people try and feed us. That's like a good thing to try and get across. Burning yourself draws people to the most extremes of it. and one of the most influential people on Twitter and in the discourse about how things are going misunderstood your point, and now is not able to, your thing is now being used as evidence of extremism, not of an actual point, or drawing people to actually talk about what's important. And like I said, what I in general, like, the Babylon Bee's awesomes, and I think Seth Dillon wants to get things right. And so I don't think it was like a malicious, purposeful reason that he misunderstood this. Like you're saying, probably a little bit of, it makes the joke a little bit funnier in some ways, but a lot of people do actually believe it this way. And like the act of extremism only bolsters their belief in that dumb point. It doesn't actually make them think more openly about it as you would hope that they would come to. But yeah, like an extreme act generally reinforces people's opinions. It doesn't actually open their minds up.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Okay, we'll move on to the last exchange here on Twitter once again, and this is between Dan Carlin from Hardcore History and Dave Smith, libertarian, comedian, all that good stuff. And it starts, this is midway through a thread, but
they're talking about
exchange,
Trump.
Yeah, talking about Donald Trump, and the exchange we're highlighting here starts with Dan Carlin saying, "You can be an authoritarian without being a Nazi. I've been professionally, I made a living doing it, analyzing U.S. politics for more than 3 decades. If you don't think the guy is authoritarian, you may not know what that looks like." And Dave Smith responds saying, "In those 3 decades, which U.S. presidents have not been authoritarian?" And Dan Carlin responds, "They have this thing called Congress that has inhibited their ability to be too authoritarian in the past. That was when Congress still had something to offer in our system. Look up the Unitarian Executive Doctrine." All right. Who got the better of that exchange?
Dave Smith, easily. And it's really unfortunate because as you and I were talking before the show, like, I really love Dan Carlin's Hardcore History series. Like his series on World War I and World War II are very, very good, and very because they tell the truth, or they seek to tell the truth. Like, really does a good job painting both sides and the effect of the Treaty of Versailles and how that drove the Germans to want to elect someone like Hitler, and how that could cause World War II and all these different things. So it was very nice and very well done. And it was surprising to me that someone who could spend hours, like literally like 10 hours, going through that history and being really thorough and trying to, paint all sides with with an objective lens, suddenly is not able to like objectively look at how Trump and Obama and George W. Bush and Bill Clinton and all the presidents in the past 30 years have not been authoritarian. Because it's like, okay, at what point, before Trump, we had Congress, as he puts it in quotation marks in his deal. It's like, okay, so did Congress authorize the war in Afghanistan? Did they authorize the war to officially declare war in Iraq, or all the different types of proxy wars that Obama did? And then even before that, like, let's just say before the 30 years, before that, like, were we not authoritarian when Woodrow Wilson put in the income tax, or when, Abraham Lincoln was suspending habeas corpus to imprison people, or when John Adams decided that he was going to use the Espionage Act to imprison his political opponents? It's like, yeah, like, basically every president has been pretty authoritarian. And like anything that you can accuse Donald Trump of being authoritarian on, there's someone who is the same or worse than him that has existed both in recent memory and not so recent memory. And so it's like people were accusing Dan Carlin of having Trump derangement syndrome. And he was saying, well, I don't have Trump derangement syndrome. I just have authoritarian derangement syndrome. And then he goes on to basically say that, like, oh yeah, we had Congress that kept authoritarians in check. It's like, no, dude, like, how is Donald Trump somehow uniquely an exception to the authoritarian or the Unitarian Executive Doctrine that he's trying to talk about has been expanding? It's like, no, like, all the presidents before Trump have expanded it, and some of them were even worse than Donald Trump were on it. And so he only proved that he has TDS in a way, because he makes it a special exception for Trump, whereas he doesn't for the other folks.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's interesting because you would think that if you were giving sort of an objective-ish analysis of it, if you see an arc of expanded power over that time frame, right? So you see, executive power has been creeping upwards, and Donald Trump, is no longer in check by this Unitarian Executive Doctrine. Wouldn't the sort of question be, okay, well, is this something that he unilaterally changed, or is it just that he's been taking advantage of the new open nature of it, in particular regards to the fact that executive power has been expanding over the last decades, right? And you look at the number of executive orders issued, and I don't remember the exact point at which, that this is just one example. I'm not saying this is the only indicative thing of what does or doesn't constitute an authoritarian, but it's a pretty good indicator, at least, to see how much independent action the executive was trying to take, and them trying to legislate essentially outside of the scope of the Congress. And I don't remember the exact point. It's been a long time since I took my U.S. presidency class in college when I studied this, but there's a pretty steep jump when you start looking at, and the executive orders started out with a lot of things that would be like, okay, we're going to name this national park X, Y, or Z. But then the numbers of them started jumping exponentially, increasing more and more and more as you get into the modern century. And they're not only just a number of sort of routine things, but also in the substance and the scope of what they're trying to do. And Congress has sort of retreated on a lot of these things, not keeping it in check. Not exercising the power of the purse, for instance, when it comes to, pulling back troops, because you obviously have sort of the game of chicken where the executive branch is going to say, we're going to move troops here. And after, is it either 60 days, maybe, I think, you're supposed to not be able to have them there anymore unless Congress specifically approves funding for it. But of course, none of them want to be the people who come back to their constituents and say, I voted against funding the troops, essentially. So the executive gets that de facto power. And so once the first person kind of did that, well, then of course the next person who wants to do that is going to do that, and maybe push the envelope a little bit more. And so my point here is that, yeah, Donald Trump may be authoritarian by, if you depending on how you want to measure your metrics, but I don't think that the expanding power that he's saying that is the defense for everyone else, I don't think it was uniquely open, and he certainly hasn't explained how it's been uniquely defied by Trump that, like, Barack Obama, for instance, didn't do, or that Joe Biden has not done. I think when you look at the scope of it, it's just the scope of what the presidents are doing has been widened and widened. And in order for, the widening to happen, you need pressure to begin. So it'd be like saying, well, if Stalin was elected, or maybe Mussolini was elected to the U.S. presidency in 1910, he probably would be a lot less effective at doing the things he did for ill in the US than he would be in Italy. But that doesn't make him less authoritarian. And it doesn't mean that what he would be doing was less authoritarian, in particular if you push the envelope relative to the powers you had at the time. So it is a matter of history and perspective and the scope creep, which he seems to completely ignore, which is kind of confusing for a historian.
Yes, and it's like you think about any sort of power that, like, there's a lever of power that was created by a predecessor, and then the current person in power chooses to pull it. It's like, I just think of that lever as something that the predecessor would have pulled if they had had access to it, because they set up access to it under the rule. They just didn't get an opportunity to pull it. And so, like you're saying, you see that arc of history, and the bully pulpit of the executive branch began under Theodore Roosevelt. And because he was like, oh, well, I want the presidency to be a little bit more activist. And it's like, coincidentally, we started getting, after Theodore Roosevelt and beyond, like, people started using that as precedent for, like, well, my predecessor did this, so I can do that. And like you're saying, the explosion of executive orders into not only just like naming a monument, but into like crazy in scope of using trillions of dollars and getting millions of people killed. It's both an issue of quantity and for lack of a better term, quality. Like, they become more and more powerful and more awful. And so, it's just like I was saying, Dan Carlin's Trump derangement syndrome is confirmed by the fact that he applies a standard that I agree with him on. I agree that Trump is an authoritarian, that he did things that were authoritarian, that he expanded power, and that he used power he shouldn't have. But he uniquely assigns that to him while overlooking, our current president, Joe Biden, as well as all the presidents that Dan Carlin, during the period which Dan Carlin was being a quote unquote professional historian. And what's so disappointing again about this is, like, Dan Carlin does such a fantastic job in anything that he does other than this, at being like, think of it from this other person's side, or think about why the arc of this came up, or think about how, because the Japanese had these systems of tradition, like how it inevitably followed that we were going to get into a war with them at some point. It's like he does such a good job, but for some reason with Trump, like suddenly all of that gets thrown out the window and it's just like Orange Man bad, for lack of a better term. And it really makes me sad. And I will still listen to Hardcore History because he does a really good job in general, but maybe not on anything more recent.
Yeah, it's a bummer. So I don't know. It is interesting that Trump really does seem to have uniquely broken people, and hopefully, I mean, I guess I'm trying to think, and I'm like,
why do you think that is? Why do you think it's?
Well, I think it is because of his demeanor more than anything else. Because I think that people, like the take we had earlier with, the baby in the freezer, people want to hold on to their preconceived worldviews and they will rationalize and justify it. And so, for instance, if you learn about Obama drone striking, a place, you can sort of think about the veneer of authority he had and how eloquent of a speaker he was, or whatever you wanted to attribute to him, whether or not it was that true. You wanted to give him credit and show, well, no, he was official, so he must know something I don't. And a lot of people look at Donald Trump and the way that he speaks and the way he communicates and think, I'm not that crass, I'm not that stupid. And so if he's up there, like, how could we get to this point? And I just think it really breaks people's preconceived brains about what the government is and what elections are.
Yeah. that's by revealing it. By revealing
exactly.
What it is.
Yeah. That's my thought.
Yeah, I saw this hilarious meme, and it was basically not a meme, it was a post, and it was like, it had a news article about how Obama shut down and got some people in trouble because they flew drones over his property in Martha's Vineyard, and it was like it had the little caption, it was like, the definition of can dish it but can't take it. And I was like, yeah, that's basically true, man.
Oh,
like
no.
But it, like you're saying, there's like in that instance or any other instance, there's like a veneer of, it's official, and this is higher level thinking in politics or whatever. And like Trump just exposes it for how stupid it all is, and he is a part of the stupidity and the blob and the swamp that he goes for. And if people could somehow transfer their outrage and understanding of how awful Trump is and realize that everyone in Washington, D.C. is that awful or worse, we would all be much better. But because they've lived, like Julian Assange's take, they did not start with the truth. They were fed lies for so long. We've been fed this veneer of like, oh yeah, like everything's great, and we have politicians who are good and in general look out for the good of the people. Like it breaks too many foundational principles, and that must be what leads to this. Like, someone has to be to blame, right? It's too terrifying to admit the actual truth, so we're going to only admit a portion of it and be angry at a portion of it, and that portion right now is Trump.
Exactly right. I think that's
it for me. So
I think that's all we can say. All right. Well, thanks so much for listening to this episode. Make sure to like and share with your friends if you enjoyed it. It helps us out a ton. And we'll catch you on the next one.